The inventory of Thornmere Hall was 31 pages long, and Sophronia Delacourt had read every word of it 3 times. Since the morning, her father's solicitor had handed it to her with the expression of a man who had already rehearsed his apologies and found them inadequate. The inventory catalogued the main house with its 11 bedrooms and a conservatory that had been losing its argument with the northern weather for the better part of a decade. It catalogued the farmland and the walled kitchen garden and a pond of no particular distinction. It catalogued the furniture, most of it serviceable, some of it magnificent, one settee in the morning room that simply had to be seen to be believed, and the silver, the china, the cellar, and the library, which was considerable and which Sophronia had spent most of her childhood inside. It catalogued the debts, which were not modest at all, and which represented 20 years of a man who had loved his estate far more than he had understood how to keep it. And at the very bottom of the 31st page, in Mr. Selden's small, precise hand, there was a final entry. One locked cabinet, east study, contents unverified, key not located at time of inventory. She had read that line 4 times. She was the only person alive who knew exactly what was inside it. Sophronia arrived at Thornmere's tradesman's entrance on a Thursday morning in November, with a canvas bag over one arm and a false name that still felt strange in her mouth. She had given herself the name Lark. Sophie Lark, recently arrived from Leeds, seeking a position as kitchen maid. She had paid a woman at an agency in York to arrange the placement without references, which had cost her nearly the last of her accessible money, and had kept her up for 2 consecutive nights, rehearsing the ways this could go wrong. She had not counted on going wrong quite so quickly. The new owner's carriage came down the lane from the east at the same moment she was crossing the gravel yard from the west gate, and there was no graceful way to pretend she had not seen it. She stood and watched a tall man step down, broad across the shoulder, dark-coated, with the unhurried movement of someone who had learned that the world generally waited for him. He glanced across the yard, saw her, held her gaze for a moment with the calm, faintly assessing look of a man filing new information away for later use. Then Mrs. Crowley appeared in the kitchen doorway and called, "Lark? You'll be Lark, then." And Sophronia turned and went inside before any further assessment could occur. Dorian Farrow, the Duke of Aldenvale, had not come to Thornmere Hall looking for complications. He had come looking for the particular silence of a house that asked nothing of him, at a sufficient remove from London that his mother's weekly letters would require 2 days in each direction, giving him 4 days of peace per exchange. He had bought this estate for that silence. He had not bought it for whatever was generating the inexplicable sense, within 48 hours of his arrival, that someone in his household did not quite belong to it. The kitchen maid, the one who had arrived the same morning he had. She was not in uniform. That was the first thing, easily explained. She was new. The household had been in some disarray since the previous owner's death. Perhaps there had been no time to arrange proper dress. But the second anomaly was harder to dismiss, and the third harder still. She held correspondence with 2 hands, carefully, in the manner of someone who understood that written words were not to be treated carelessly. When she passed through the library, to dust, she did not look at the shelves the way a person cataloging their next task looked at shelves. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they once loved and did not expect to see again. And she moved through this house with a particular familiarity that the Duke had seen before, only in servants who had worked the same rooms for 30 years. She had been here 4 days. He filed the observation and said nothing. He was a man who had learned through 3 years of military service that the most useful information arrives to those who wait for it. On the 6th night, Sophronia went to the library. She had been working methodically through the rooms she could access without suspicion, moving in the early mornings when the rest of the household was still slow with sleep. The east study, where the cabinet was, had been locked since the new owner's arrival. She had tried twice and been thwarted, once by the housekeeper and once by her own nerve failing her at the last moment. The library she knew she could manage. She went in after midnight, carrying a single candle, intending to retrieve a household accounts ledger she'd spotted earlier, a book from the year her mother had died, when her father had taken over the management of the estate and recorded everything in his deliberate, slightly chaotic hand. She had wanted to see if he'd made any reference to where he'd hidden the church register. She had also, if she was honest with herself, simply wanted to see his handwriting. She was not entirely certain which of those was the real reason. She found the ledger. She sat on the floor beside the lowest shelf to read it, the candle balanced on the floorboards, and she had been so intent on searching the cramped columns of figures for any mention of the church at Harrogate that she did not hear the door. "The library," said a voice from the doorway, "is not generally within a kitchen maid's remit." She was on her feet so quickly that the candle tipped sideways. She caught it. Dorian Farrow stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, holding a lamp, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not anger. It was something more deliberate than anger, the look of a man whose calculation has just been confirmed and who is deciding what to do with that information. "Your Grace," she said, "I apologize, I was reading." His gaze moved to the ledger in her hand. Whose handwriting is that? She could have lied. She had been lying with reasonable competence for 6 days. But he was looking at her with the particular steady attention of someone who has already made his determination and is waiting only for the acknowledgement, and she found that she could not hold both the lie and his gaze at the same time, and she was not willing to look away. "My father's," she said. The silence that followed was thorough. "Sit down," the Duke said, "and tell me what you are actually doing in my house." She told him most of it. She left out the cabinet because she did not yet know if she could trust him, and because the cabinet was the only advantage she had that he could not take away. Her father, the late Viscount Delacourt, had married her mother in a private ceremony at a small country church in the summer of 1793, 8 months before the grander society wedding the family had insisted upon. He had done this because he had loved her mother and had been 22 and impatient, and had not yet learned that the world punishes impatience, entitled men with particular thoroughness. The 2 ceremonies had created a legal ambiguity that had never mattered while her father was living. When he died, his younger brother, Lord Whitaker, raised it immediately, with the focused enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment for 2 decades. If the first marriage was invalid, which Whitaker's lawyers were arguing on a technicality of registration, then the second ceremony was the legal one, and Sophronia, born between them, was illegitimate. And if she was illegitimate, the trust her father had set aside for her, a considerable sum held entirely separate from the estate, reverted to the family line and therefore to her uncle. "He sold the estate," the Duke said. "Yes, the trust is separate. It was set up through a different solicitor 15 years ago, specifically." She paused. "Specifically because he knew the estate was not going to survive. He wanted to make certain I would. And the church register from the first ceremony. He told me when I was 9 that he'd kept it here, that it was proof the first marriage was properly recorded, regardless of what anyone claimed about the registration." She pressed her hands flat against the ledger in her lap. "He died before he told me where." Dorian Farrow was quiet for a long moment. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds. "Lord Whittaker," he said. "He has been in contact with this household." Something went still in her chest. "He has written to you?" "Twice. His most recent letter arrived yesterday. He turned. He is coming on Friday." It was Tuesday. She had 3 days. She found Eli in the kitchen garden at first light the following morning. He was 70 years old at minimum and had been groundskeeper at Thornmere since before Sophronia was born. He had taught her the names of every variety of apple in the old orchard. He had been the only person on the estate, in her memory, who had never once spoken to her, as though she were made of something easily broken. He looked at her when she sat beside him on the cold stone bench, and said, without any particular surprise, "I wondered when you'd come." "Ellie," she said, "where is it?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small envelope, worn soft with years of handling, and placed it in her hands. "I was there," he said, "the morning your parents married. Your father asked me to stand witness because he needed one quickly and trusted me to say nothing after. The curate gave me a copy of the entry. I've kept it in my coat every day since your father died because I didn't know when it would be needed. Only that it would." She held the envelope without opening it. Her hands were not entirely steady. "You could have come to me," she said. "You were in Bath. Then your father was ill. Then—" He stopped, began again. "I'm an old man, Miss Sophronia. I didn't know who else to trust with it, only you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Eli," and meant it in the way that takes up more space than 2 words can usually hold. That evening she went to the Duke and placed the envelope on the desk in front of him. And then she told him about the cabinet. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Whittaker's solicitors," he said, "will argue that a single witness copy held privately for years is insufficient on its own. They'll claim it could have been altered. I know. That's why I need the cabinet." She met his eyes. "My father's original correspondence is in there, his own copy of the church record, his letters to the curate, the notarized documentation he'd begun preparing." She paused. "I know the combination. He taught me when I was 8. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood. "I'll come with you," he said. The cabinet opened on the 3rd attempt. Sophronia's hands were cold, and she had lost count the first time, and the second time she had been too aware of the Duke standing behind her to hold the sequence clearly. Her mother's birthday, the year her parents had first met, the month. But the 3rd time, the tumblers turned with a sound she had been hearing in her memory for 3 years. Inside, a leather folio thick with papers, a sealed letter addressed in her father's handwriting to my daughter, when the time comes, and beneath both, a flat wooden case containing a single folded document, certified and notarized, with the seal of the church at Harrogate still intact after 22 years. She stood holding the document and did not cry. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something that had no precise name. Something like a door opening into a room she had been locked out of for years and finding it exactly as she had left it. "Is it sufficient?" she asked. "Combined with what Eli holds." The Duke read over her shoulder, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and entirely certain. "Yes, I'd say unambiguously." Lord Whittaker arrived on Friday at 10:30. He was a large man, florid and confident, who carried his certainty the way men do when they have never had a room disagree with them. He came with 2 solicitors and the air of someone who has already decided how the morning will end. Dorian Farrow received him in the front drawing room. Sophronia was not there when Whittaker entered. She came in 2 minutes later from the side door wearing the blue dress she had brought from Bath and had been keeping for precisely this occasion. Her hair was arranged with simple care. Her hands were at her sides, open and steady. Not clasped, not braced. Simply present. Whittaker went very still. "Miss Delacourt," the Duke said pleasantly, from where he stood by the fireplace. "I believe you know Lord Whittaker." "I do," Sophronia said. She crossed to the desk where the documents were laid out in careful sequence. The church record, Eli's copy, her father's sealed correspondence, the notarized folio, and she placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at her uncle across the full width of all of it. "And I believe, my lord, that you know what these are." Whittaker's solicitors bent over the documents for a considerable time. They examined them again. They had the expressions of men who had been promised a straightforward morning and were now reconsidering the arrangements. The church record was unimpeachable. The notarization had been filed 6 years prior with a solicitor in Bristol who had no connection to the Delacourt family, and therefore no reason to be partial. Eli's copy matched in every particular. Lord Whittaker left at noon. He said very little on his way out. His solicitors said even less. Whatever he had expected the morning to be, it had declined to cooperate. That evening, when the house had gone quiet, Sophronia carried the letter her father had written her to the east study and read it there, alone, by lamplight. She had wanted to read it alone. When she finished, she sat for a while with both hands pressed flat against the paper. Her father had not been a courageous man. He had loved her without reservation and had failed to protect her with the same energy, and she had been carrying the weight of that particular contradiction for 3 years and had not yet worked out entirely what to do with it. She was working on it. She suspected she would be for some time, and had decided that this was neither a failure nor a resolution, but simply the truth of the thing, that some losses do not conclude so much as they become familiar, and that familiar is not the same as fine, but it is something you can live alongside. The Duke knocked on the open door and stood in the frame without entering. "I won't ask what it says," he said. "No," she agreed, "thank you." A moment passed. Then he said, "I want to say something plainly, so there is no ambiguity about what I mean." She looked at him. "This house is not yours to inherit," he said. "The estate was legally sold. The trust is yours. Your father structured it correctly, and Whittaker has no claim on it now that your legitimacy is established. But Thornmere itself belongs to me. I want to be clear that I'm not offering it back to you." "I know," she said. "I came for the register, not the house." "I know you did." He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from the desk. The chair she had once watched her father conduct estate business from, when she had been small enough to sit cross-legged on the rug and not be noticed. "And I want you to know that you are welcome here, as long as you need to be, as a guest and not as Sophie Lark. But I want to say something beyond that as well." She waited. "I am 32 years old," he said. "I came to this estate because I had convinced myself that silence was what I required. I have been here 3 weeks. In that time you have organized the library, resolved a dispute between the kitchen and the groundskeeper over the herb beds, correctly identified that the grain contracts Mr. Selden sent were structured to the disadvantage of this estate, and told me so, with a frankness I am not accustomed to receiving." He paused. The silence, it turns out, was not what I needed. Sophronia looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is a very unusual way to say what you appear to be saying. I am given to understand I'm an unusual person." "You're not," she said. "You're remarkably consistent." And then, because she had spent 3 weeks being careful and was very tired of it, and because he was looking at her with the same direct attention he brought to everything, the kind that made deflection feel like more effort than honesty. "Yes. Yes to staying. Yes to all of it," she said. "Ask me properly in the morning when neither of us has had a long day." Something crossed his face, brief and unguarded, arriving before he'd had time to decide whether to allow it. She filed it away carefully, the way one keeps certain things. "Good night, Miss Delacourt," he said. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. In the spring, when the solicitors had finished and the documents filed and the trust transferred, and Lord Whittaker had retreated to Lincolnshire to manage his grievances privately, Sophronia sat in the east study of Thornmere Hall and opened the inventory one final time. 31 pages, the farmland, the garden, the unremarkable pond, the library, which she had recently recatalogued according to a system she found considerably more sensible than the previous arrangement. The debts, which were settled, and at the bottom of the 31st page, in Mr. Selden's small, careful script, one locked cabinet, east study, contents unverified, key not located at time of inventory. She took her pen and wrote beneath it, in her own clear hand, 4 words. The Duke came in from the hall, carrying 2 cups of tea, with the focused concentration of a man who had decided that domestic competence was achievable with sufficient determination and had set about proving it. He looked over her shoulder at the page. Contents verified, all accounted for. He set both cups down and said nothing for a moment. Then he placed his hand briefly over hers on the desk, simply, without ornamentation, in the manner of someone who has learned that the most important things rarely require embellishment. "Yes," he said, "I'd say so." Outside, the walled garden was doing what gardens do in April, quietly, without asking permission from anyone. Eli's apple trees were coming into blossom. The window of the east study was open, and the morning was finding its way in, and Sophronia Delacourt, who had once arrived at this house through the back gate with a borrowed name and a dwindling margin of hope, turned a page and stayed.